You're listening to In Sickness, a podcast about caregiving with Allison Breininger and Justin Bima. Hey, good morning.
Good morning, friend. Hey, I'm excited to hear. Tell me what has been going on with Sarah's new medication that you told us about last time.
Yes, I have good news to report. It seems to continue to be helping her. She's got, her fatigue is much better. She has more energy. She's working on more of her like mail projects and just kind of doing stuff. Yeah, actually last night we were watching TV and she picked up her knitting needles for the first time in, I don't know, 2 or 3 years and just kind of started doing some knitting. And it was just this amazing little moment and she loved it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's been really, the results have been very promising and I still feel a little bit of that like cautious optimism.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, so far I don't think we've had anything that has made this much difference in how she's done. So it's just, it's a big thing.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing. Because it was just 2 weeks ago we talked and we were sort of like, like, the whole episode we talked about like, want to have some hope, but we've been burned so many times before. And so to have it make a difference.
And it hasn't been without its ups and downs. I think part of it is with her ME, there's, you have a limit and you try to always stay below that limit. Otherwise you crash really hard.
Right.
And so now her limit is different.
Oh,
and so
interesting.
It's kind of finding where that balance is.
Yeah.
So the other day I was working here and I got a phone call from her, and that's not uncommon. If she's not doing well and just kind of needs me, she can just like hit, call me and the phone rings and I go over there.
From across the house.
Yes, from across the house.
Yeah.
So I went over there and she's laying there in bed and she's kind of gesturing. And it took me a bit to figure out what she was gesturing for. And she wanted like a pen and paper. And so I got that and she kind of scribbled on there, can't talk.
What?
And then she kind of gestured again for it again. And so another piece of paper, can't move, which was scary.
Oh my gosh.
Because this was a new thing. Because if you remember, there was the time before Christmas where she crashed and like couldn't talk, but that was like a slow slide into that.
Yeah, right.
So then she had another note to write, which was like she needed to move from her side onto her back, and she like wasn't able to do that. And so I had to help her do that. So I didn't really know what was going on.
Yeah.
So I just kind of, stayed there with her, and she kind of slowly she was able to kind of start talking a little bit and moving a little bit, but it was just this really odd experience.
Yeah. What do you attribute that to? I mean, is that a thing that like when you have ME, this can just happen, or like?
I don't know exactly, because this is a new experience.
Okay.
Our kind of thought is it was some sort of, intense crash from she has more energy now and maybe pushed further than she should have, or than her envelope allowed for or something. And this was maybe a result of that. So, I mean, it's not, she's had a couple other crashes that haven't been nearly that severe. So it's with the doing better, there's like a new learning to kind of figure out, if this is now what normal looks like, or she has to kind of recalibrate, I guess.
Yeah.
So there's been a little bit of that.
What is that like for you in that moment, right? Like you're in the middle of your workday and to walk in and out of nowhere, there's your wife and she can't talk and she can't move. I mean, like what goes through your head in that moment?
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking at what point is this something that I have to like call 911 for?
Right.
And it was, I don't even know, other than just like feeling fear, what's going on, and just like not knowing what to do. Like I can't, there's nothing I can do right now to fix this or to change it. And thankfully with some time, it kind of eased out of it enough.
Yeah.
But that was a tough moment.
I mean, it just makes me think about like, there you are in the middle of your workday and you can go from 0 to 60, right?
Yep.
And you had no idea that was about to happen or could happen or any of those things. And so, like you said, like I think the interesting thing is like if she didn't have this history of chronic illness and suddenly your wife couldn't talk or move, like certainly you would call 911, right? And so like the complicated picture of what you have of like, okay, well, I could, but are they going to know what Emmy, like all those pieces that have to go through your head, and you don't have a medical background. And so then you're making these decisions in the moment. And again, like in the middle of your workday when you weren't expecting any of this to happen.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. That's just, things can swing unexpectedly. And that's one of the really hard things about, I think probably for a lot of caregivers, but particularly for our situation, is how variable things can be. And just all of a sudden it's that making that hard switch to a different mode. And
Right.
Yeah.
It makes me think too, because, when we talked last time about hope and we've talked about things like toxic positivity. And so I can imagine someone might listen and be like, oh, Sarah has this new medication. She's better.
Right.
Ta-da. Right. And because I think that the human nature wants a pretty bow on the package. And so like we saw that when Sean had his bone marrow transplant, people were like, you're over the hump, or whatever.
Yeah.
And we had to do a lot of education, which is exhausting, but about like, yes, this hump, and there will be more humps coming down the road, right? Which can sound really pessimistic, but is our reality. And so I can imagine for you wanting to celebrate, like there's improvement, and also to like help the world understand like improvement, yes. And it's not like, oh, we just got to cross this whole thing off our list.
Yeah.
Right. And even that her improvement is like an inch up the scale, right? And still very far from the energy that you or I would have.
Right.
Yeah. How do you balance that? Like, and how do you, both within yourself, but also like with other people in your life to sort of help them?
I think the fact that we're in this pandemic and like not interacting with a lot of people makes it easier, because we're kind of in our own little bubble and can, we can celebrate it here knowing the asterisks associated with it, I guess.
For sure. Yeah.
So it hasn't felt like we've had to do a lot of kind of that education yet. I'm sure there will be some of that. And again, I don't know, is this, have we reached kind of the new plateau, or, how this is going to continue to go? But
yeah, I was going to ask that. Is it a cumulative drug? So do you feel like it'll just like potentially continue to like get better and better and better? Or is it sort of like it gets to a place and like this is as effective as it's going to be? Or do you not know?
My gut feel is that it's not like an accumulative thing. But again, I don't know. And I don't know if anyone really knows.
Yeah,
it's a new enough treatment that.
Right.
Yeah. But for right now, we're taking this win for sure.
Yeah. Wow.
What about you? How has your week been going since we last talked?
Yeah, it's been, I feel like every time we've talked the last couple of times, I've been like, oh, it's been a week. And it has continued to be a week. I don't know. I'm kind of struggling. And part of it, some of it, there are some reasons I can point to, and others there aren't necessarily. And that's different for me. I definitely tip on the mental health scale towards anxious.
Right.
Like, so anxiety's always been a part of my life. And then certainly, the caregiving duties have upped the ante there.
For sure.
But depression isn't typically something that I struggle with. I am typically pretty like joyful friend, even in the hard stuff. And so I've just had a lot of moments lately where I've just been like, oh, I'm just sad. And I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, and I don't, like I think the year anniversary of the lockdown, and then I'm watching a lot of people rush back out into the world, and knowing that like we're not going to be there for a long time feels hard. And, I think there's just maybe a lot of things that are going on, but it's also, so it's sort of like the typical anxious stuff that I have on top of some sadness. And actually my supervisor at work the other day said, I feel like you're the bellwether for me, because she said there are 2 days I can think of in the whole last year since the pandemic has started that you have not shown up joyful, even despite all the things that happen in your life. And she said, so when I see that you aren't joyful, I realize like, whoa, I better check on everybody. So it's kind of like, well, I don't know if that's the best approach. Like if you wait for like the most joyful person to go down before you check on everybody. Mm-hmm. But it was just kind of an interesting because I was like, you just look around. I spend my day in Zoom meetings, right? And sometimes I just look at all the little squares. I'm like, oh, we're done. You know, like we're our little faces. We've been through a lot, you know? And so I was thinking, I know you and I have had I've really been grateful over the years of our friendship that anxiety and mental health is something that we've been able to like openly talk about.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you would feel comfortable if we sort of opened up that conversation here today and brought others in and let them listen in on us talking about that. Would that feel comfortable to you?
Yeah, I would love to do that.
So what do you feel like what are you comfortable sharing about like your experiences?
Yeah. So I think for me, my going back before Sarah got sick, and I don't know, maybe a couple of years before she got sick, I was having a lot of anxiety. I was having some pretty severe panic attacks. And from like now where I am, I can look back and I can see that clearly long before that, there was, I was anxious and had periods of depression and all of that for whatever reason at the time, I wasn't self-aware of or something. But yeah, so I was having these panic attacks and a lot of anxiety. And it took a long time to get to the point of, okay, I need to do something for this, to like get help for this. And I think anxiety definitely feeds into that, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah.
So I think I started. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Can you unpack that just a little bit? Like, of course, I'm like, yep. But other people who might not experience that might not understand. So can you say like, how does anxiety feed into you not necessarily going to get help for anxiety?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's a big step, and there's a lot of unknowns with what's going to happen there, and that's any unknowns. My anxiety just is off to the races, and there's a certain like vulnerability there
for sure
that can be uncomfortable, and just opening up about that and asking for help for that. All of those kind of things, just kind of, how is this going to go?
Right.
What if they don't think I need anything? What if they think it's like, you're actually really bad and we need to do something extreme? Or your anxiety can just run with that.
Yeah. So it's like a vicious cycle. The thing that you actually need help for might prevent you from going to get help for it.
But I think certainly anxiety around getting help hasn't gone away. But I think that first hurdle was a big step for me.
Yeah.
And that took a long time to get to that point.
Yeah.
And I wish I would have been able to do that sooner, but I'm glad that it did happen.
Yeah.
And so I went to my doctor and talked about it, and thinking that I would just get a prescription for something, but he wanted me to first, try therapy. And so that's something I started. And again, that is something that starting that before Sarah got sick, that was an amazing thing to have that established.
Yeah.
So like through all of these years, I've had that as a resource to work through stuff or just kind of like vent. And that's been hugely helpful. So
you've continued all these years to see that therapist?
I had to switch at one point because my first therapist went on leave or something. And so I had to switch.
Okay.
And I feel very, very fortunate that I was able to like go online, find a therapist that looked like this is going to be a good match.
Yep.
Was able to get an appointment with her, and it seemed like a good fit. Because that's another thing is like anxiety around, okay, now I'm going to have to like see a bunch of different like people, and like how do I know if it's a fit? And like this just seems it's hard enough to open up to one person, but
to like
all of that
date the therapist essentially,
right. So the fact that worked out as good as it did, and then having the same experience, she had someone to refer me to who was also a good fit. So that's been very fortunate. So that helped some, but I still, it didn't eliminate my anxiety.
Right.
And so I ended up getting a prescription, getting some meds for that. And then I think some of that helped. And then after a couple of years, I ended up seeing a psychiatrist as well. And so that's been a multi-year process. And through those years, I've had, the anxiety has certainly been there, but there's also, ups and downs with depression, periods of that as well. And so at times it's been really frustrating trying to work through medication for it, because it feels like it's all kind of like trial and error sort of stuff. Like and there's not like a test you can run to say this is working.
Right. And often they take weeks and weeks to kick in, right? So you don't know.
Right. And if they don't work, you can have some crazy side effects, or I've had experiences having to go off of them where like tapering off of them was just a horrible experience.
Yeah.
But I think within the last year, I feel like I'm kind of on a pretty good regiment there. And so that feels like, I'm not perfectly mentally healthy by any stretch, but at least things feel a little more stable right now.
Good.
Yeah.
I think, though, that's huge what you said, that you had things like already in place before she was sick. Yeah. I have a friend who, in like a year ago or 2 years ago now, I guess, before the pandemic, had just done a lot of work, a lot of therapy. And multiple times during this year, she has said, I'm so glad that I had just done this work with my therapist, because like I'm able to handle this thing much better because I already had this tool in my toolkit, or I'm understanding how I'm responding because I had done that,
Yeah. And so, yes, having that set up beforehand, and then also like caregiving as a thing, like certainly puts you at, I don't know if risk is the right word, but you're at a much higher percentage chance of experiencing anxiety, experiencing depression. I think I read it's, I don't know, it was a kind of a vague stat, but it was like 40 to 70% of caregivers will experience anxiety or depression, with like as many as half of them like meeting the clinical definition of them. And kind of thinking through that, it's this, like that's often in like you go to a caregiving resource thing, and like that's one of the things there is like, okay, great, you're going to be at risk for this.
Right.
And this is a thing, like caregiving is already a thing that is in the negative space. It's something that, it's kind of not talked about. It's not really recognized or acknowledged. And then because you're doing that, you're going to have this other thing that there's all of this still social stigma around. That's going to make everything harder.
Right.
And it doesn't feel like there's the community support around that. Whereas if it was, I was trying to think of a good example, and I don't know, but like if it was, caregiving gave you high blood pressure, which, maybe it does because of the stress.
Yeah.
But like that's something you could talk to people about. Like, so, caregiving made this. So, I take this, and, that helps.
Yeah.
But it's socially, it's still not something that is just out in the open conversation.
That is such a good point, Justin, because I think about that, a lot of what I talk about the negative space too is about how this is really hard, and caregivers often don't feel like they can say it's hard. Right. So even with the blood pressure thing, I wonder if caregivers would be comfortable saying like, I'm a caregiver. First of all, it's so hard that it's actually causing me to have high blood pressure that I need to take something for. Because I think even, I see so many caregivers who are like, I can't complain, and I can't say it's hard, and I can't, and so, even I think with some of the physical stuff, I feel like people would be less likely to share because they don't want to say that they're a caregiver. They don't want to complain about something. But then you're so right that like mental health piece already has a stigma around it anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember a very clear moment. And this was when so I've talked a little bit about this, but the adoption process for Maya was long and complicated and took about 2.5 years. So, and was quite awful. And it was in that time that I remember it was like one of these, like a quiz in a magazine. And I remember I was with Sean and Sean's brother, and I was like, let's all take this quiz. And it was something like, do you have anxiety or something? I don't know why I thought this would be a fun quiz that we should all take.
Right.
And when I calculated my score, I was like, oh man. And just even the questions that were being asked helped me reflect on my past. Like even things like being on an airplane or in an enclosed space, like panicking about like needing, like, what if you need to go to the bathroom? What if you need to throw up? And I was like, wait, that's a thing? Like that's that thing that I always feel is like a characteristic of this. Like I've always felt like that. I didn't know that, And so it was actually this like magazine quiz that sort of brought to light for me that some of the ways I had always felt were actually characteristics of anxiety. And so at that point, I found a therapist and saw that person for quite a while, including when Sean was diagnosed and all of these things. And actually ended up getting rid of her because at one point it felt like, because I would walk in each week and I would be like, I need to tell you that I am not like a pathological liar. Like all of these things actually really did just happen in my life. And I know it seems crazy that I'm saying that all of this just happened in the last 7 days, but it really did. And it got to a point where it almost felt like she was like, what happened this week?
Oh.
like she was like ready for the next episode of like Allison's crazy life. And I was just like, no. And so I have not found a new person. I have not looked, I should say, for a new person, and I should. But I think around that time, I also started on like an anti-anxiety med. I think at that point I was just like, I just got to get through this adoption process. Right. But then here came a kid who like never slept. So then I was like, well, now I got to get through this. And, and then Rashawn. And so all the things. So that's sort of been an ongoing piece for me. And then certainly I see there are moments where it spikes, right? So it's sort of like an underlying piece. But then like when there's a new diagnosis or when it's time for scans or when the pandemic began, like all these things where it's just like on top of that. I also find that, and this is, the world that we're in, but the days that I feel the most anxious are when I am being inundated with noises and alerts from all the places. Yeah. Right. So like all the email things and all the texts, and it's just like ding, 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 are the days that I just feel like very overstimulated and anxious. So it's not even so much like worried about something, but it's more like the stimulation that's coming from all directions at me, Yeah.
With things like that, I know I'm better at it now, but there's been a lot of times where whether it's all that information coming in or it's just having to make a lot of decisions and just kind of feeling that overwhelm and not realizing until like you're way into it that like you are really your anxious energy is like really cranked up. And at that point it feels too late to try to stop it and just kind of needing to ride it out, which is not comfortable.
What do you do in those moments?
I don't have a like this is a thing I do to make it stop. It's kind of okay, this is happening. I know that it's not going to stay this way. And that's something that's a newer thing to kind of be able to have that mindset or just be able to think like, okay, this is not permanent.
Right.
And I know that it's going to go back and that sometimes you just have to wait for it to pass. I think overall, I've gotten better at, with the anxiety, catching that earlier in that cycle. And then it's easier to kind of maybe take a step back and maybe just kind of sit and somehow just like sitting and like looking out the window, just kind of like observing the bigger picture. Can be really helpful for me. Yeah. And so when I'm able to kind of feel it sooner, which is a skill that, to take developing, and it's not always there or feel like it's there to use, has been helpful. I think like in the early part, and I think this was just as maybe this is time frame, this is maybe just as Sarah is kind of starting to get sick. So I had kind of like a 3-pronged thing for dealing. And at this point I hadn't come to terms with like, yes, I also have depression. This isn't just me like anxiety. So I had medication, which kind of brought the overall like anxious noise level down. I had therapy to help like develop tools to kind of dealing with the anxiety. Yeah. And then at that time I was doing a lot of just like breathing meditation to just kind of like focus on your breath. Yeah. And they're noticing your thoughts like very early in the process. And that kind of helped to like develop that early detection sort of muscle. Yeah. And for, I don't know what reasons, that's all not as much of a rigorous thing now as it was then, but that was a very helpful kind of approach at the time. Yeah. Yeah. I have the Headspace app. Okay. Yeah. Which is a meditation app. And I find that so helpful, like in those moments. And I know that if I did it regularly, it would make a consistent difference. But especially in those moments where I just feel like, that I can turn on like even a 10-minute app. And I've been trying now that it's springtime here, like trying to sit near a window where there's sun or open a window there where there's breeze or something that again takes me away from like the scrolling and the input, right? And helps me just to take like, okay, 10 minutes. Yeah. To just breathe. Even in, like I said, my days are full of Zoom meetings. And so even if I have like 90 seconds in between jumping off of the screen and onto the next one, trying to do some of those, because I mean, the poll is like, okay, let's check and see what messages came in the last hour, but instead just be like, okay, I'm going to take 90 seconds to breathe.
and to close my eyes or to look out the window or to whatever that is, to sort of try to slow myself back down a little bit.
Yeah.
I think about, so, for both of us, it sounds like even if we had never had spouses who were chronically ill, these would be things that we would be, working through in our lives, right? They were both present there before our spouses had diagnoses, and we have really stressful lives.
Yeah.
So I think about like what you went through the other day, like what happened in your body and your mind and your nervous system when you walked into that bedroom and your wife scrawled on a note, "I can't talk and I can't move." Right. And so you have this baseline thing you're already working on. You have these strategies to like keep you on a baseline, but then like, we don't know, like those are that's the kind of stuff that you and I like are thrown.
Right. And in those moments, it feels like, at least for me, things just ramp up so quickly that any like knowledge of a tool that helps to kind of put the brakes on that, like that's completely out the window. There's no,
for sure. Yeah.
I can't, I'm not even aware that there's something that I could do to take a step back. And I can't take a step back from that either.
No.
And so in some of those times, at least sometimes there's adrenaline that kind of seems to override it initially, but then you're left, once that wears off, you're left with the
exactly. So I think in that, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say you're left with all of that anxiety and just kind of the like hangover from that.
Totally. Yeah, I was going to say, because in that moment, like I'm not saying that in that moment you should be like, just one moment, I need to take some
I need to meditate breathe for a little bit. Yeah.
Right. But I think it's the after. So actually last night we were watching, what is it? It was like in some Avenger thing. Maya loves the Avengers. Okay. So sometimes I'm like, I'm going to be a good mom. I'm going to watch this shoot 'em up movie with her because I love her.
Right.
So it was this new Winter Soldier Falcon something. I don't know. And there was a guy in it who apparently is 104 years old.
Okay.
And used to be a soldier. And he's with his therapist.
Oh.
And he said to her, "I have been fighting nonstop for 90 years. And this is the first time in my life that I have had a moment to sit with that. And I'm just trying to process, because I have not had a moment to process in 90 years of fighting." And it made me think about like us as caregivers, right? And that so often we're just in it. And there isn't the time to process. And I think actually, a couple times ago, we talked about, I had this weird sort of terrible gap between Sean's diagnosis and his surgery.
Yeah.
Which felt really gross because there was more time to process. Typically it's like diagnosis, surgery, bam, but they like immediate.
Yeah.
And there isn't really time to think about it. But having those extra weeks really brought out like time and feelings about like, what does this mean? And oh my gosh, there's cancer in his mouth right now. And so I just think about that because you and I are in this sort of constant, I mean, there are acute moments like that, but it's not like that was like a one-time thing. And now you're like done, right? Like that could happen today. That could, like hard things can happen today. And so that there's often not that time to process. And so how do we, what's happening to us as it just like builds and builds and builds and builds and builds over what feels like 90 years of it,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that stress accumulates and it's not good for you, I imagine. I mean, I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a mental health professional, but it just seems intuitively that all of that stress building up, that's not helpful.
Right.
It's only going to make things worse. And yet I don't have an answer for what you do.
Right.
It's just, to me, it feels like just one of those situations that it just is what it is. And I don't know that that's the best approach to that or not, but that's where I am right now.
Yeah. It's so frustrating sometimes because it's like, this role is hard enough anyway. And like you said, like any resource site you go to about caregiving, it basically says like, sorry, caregivers, kind of screwed because you're physically you're going to like go down the tubes. Mentally, you're going down the tubes. Right. And so it's like, oh, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. And so it just feels so frustrating that then in the end, like we might need caregivers, or we probably do need caregivers because like we're having impacts as well. Right. And yet we continue doing this thing. It's not like someone who can be like, oh, your job is stressful, you should find a new job. Like that's not the way this works for us. And so to know that it's not going away, I found this term, it's called allostatic load.
Okay.
And the definition is it's the wear and tear on the body, which accumulates as an individual is exposed to repeated or chronic stress.
Yes.
Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. It says part of efficient regulation is the reduction of uncertainty. Humans naturally do not like feeling as if surprise is inevitable. Mm-hmm. Because of this, we constantly strive to reduce the uncertainty of future outcomes. And allostasis helps us to do this by anticipating needs and planning how to satisfy them ahead of time. But it takes a considerable amount of the brain's energy to do this. And if it fails to resolve the uncertainty, the situation may become chronic and result in the accumulation of allostatic load.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Right?
Yeah. Does it say what to do with that load?
Help us. Right. Wikipedia. What do we do next? It does not. No.
Yeah.
Basically, it just says that we're in trouble. Right. I don't even want to click on the button that says implications of allostatic load on health. Do I even want to know?
I don't think so.
I don't think we want to know.
No.
I clicked on it briefly. I saw the word mortality. So I'm just going to walk away from that. But I think that's so true. Like it's sort of like me wanting to clean closets. Stick with me here for a minute. Okay. So I want to clean, like the other day, I cleaned out like all of the medical supplies and organized it because at any moment we need the gauze, the thermometer, the blood pressure cuff, the whatever. And I know that at least in that moment, like by me spending a calm day cleaning that, at least in that moment, I can prepare. I can prepare now for something to make it a little bit easier then. So it's like, that's my way of, I guess, that allostasis of trying to like prepare for something. Yeah. Right. But I think I had first heard of this from somebody who was talking about her parents had twins who were in the NICU and were like in and out of sort of crisis mode for months.
Yeah.
And and then even when the babies came home, we were in this sort of crisis mode. And so we were talking about like what that felt like for her parents to be constantly listening for like the dings of the monitors and all of the things. Right. And then I was like, that sounds like us.
Yeah.
And that we are constantly like, I'm sure that there's something in subconscious for you that like is wondering, like, is she okay there in the other room? I'm over here at work in this part of the house. Is she okay over there? Is that going to happen again? What's going to happen? How is this day going to go? And for me, it's like, when is the next cancer? And how is, you know what I mean? And the impact that has on us.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of this was back like the 3-year period when Sarah was pretty much bedbound. Other than, maybe once a month we'd go to a doctor's appointment. And that was, for me, that was just such an isolating period of time because she wasn't able to be present very much at all. If I wasn't at work, I was at home to, care for her.
Yeah.
We did have a little buzzer because, if I was downstairs or something and she just had a button she could press because that's sometimes all the energy she had was to do that. And so that sounded very familiar, that just like constantly being ready for when is that gonna ding and I'm gonna have to help her. And like my sleep was horrible during that period of time because, in the middle of the night, she might need something.
Yeah.
Or just that part of your brain was still going.
For sure.
And also, like, I think during the time that I've been a caregiver, I think that's probably when my depression was at its worst. And I think that was fueled by the very much feeling alone in both like actually not seeing a lot of people.
Right.
All of the emotion around like, how do I process my wife being this sick?
Yeah.
Feeling unprepared to deal with that, feeling just isolated and alone in the experience.
Yep.
And I can't point to how I got out of that particular cycle. But one of the things that I've noticed there and kind of when I feel the depression coming back on is like, particular if Sarah's taking a nap and I have time to like do something, I just don't know what to do with my time, or like just nothing feels like what I don't know. I just don't feel like doing anything. And like, that's another kind of like thing that I've learned over time. Like, okay, that's what's happening here. And it's not something that I'm like, okay, A, then B to like fix it. But I don't know. I think for me, at least, knowing a little bit what's going on helps some.
Okay.
I think.
You mean within yourself?
Yeah. I
Yep.
can understand, okay, I'm feeling depressed, and that's what's happening.
Right.
And I think with with some of the medications I'm on, I think that also has helped a lot for not getting back to how things were when she was really sick. Yeah.
I know a couple times ago we talked about like, I'm not very good at sitting still. And I'm sure that has something to do with it as well. And I feel like it's because I always feel like I need to be doing this preparation thing. Like I should be cleaning or organizing, or I can't take a nap now because, or sometimes I feel like I should take a nap now because what if later we're at the ER? Right? Like it's just always like sort of planning and preparing and not feeling like this, like, oh, well, we can just, everything's fine, because even if it's fine right now, it might not be later.
Right.
And so, I just am appreciating how, it sounds like both of us sort of chemically have this tendency.
Yeah.
And situationally now, on top of that, we have lots of reasons to feel anxious and to feel depressed.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's like when I said these last couple of weeks, I've just been like sad. And I think for me, because that is unusual, then that also adds a thing where I'm sad, and then I'm like, why am I sad?
Right.
What's wrong with me? Come on.
Yeah.
What's going on? You know what I mean? And then I'm like, what's something going on? All the things. And I have to just be like, let's just stop for a second, Allison, and realize like all the things that are going on in the world and in your house and in your life. And there are actually a lot of reasons to be sad.
Yeah. Yeah. We haven't even mentioned the load of this pandemic for a year, and like,
oh my gosh, right.
implications on that for mental health. Like that's been
right.
Yeah. That's something I've noticed as that this has drug on, is that, I'm not doing as well as I was before.
For sure.
We were all isolating in our homes.
And actually, when you say that, it makes me realize, I think some of the hardest days I've had are days when I've seen and heard other people who are just like, it's over.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing people who are like, schools are open, vacation, I'm on an airplane, here we go, we don't need a mask, all those things. And I think that has really had an impact on me, because I think any of the moments of feeling seen in this, I feel like, are people going to forget about us?
Yeah.
I feel like, some people are rushing back and, doing things that maybe are not yet safe, which feels really hard. And then it also feels like even when it's safe for others, it won't be safe for us. And so I think that's been part of it, is sort of like, there's a bit of comfort when we were all in a space together.
Yeah.
And now it sort of feels like people are going back off into the world, and we're just going to be like left behind.
Yeah. What I've found recently is, initially there was all of this like figuring out, okay, what are the new rules, or like, how are we,
right.
how are we operating in this pandemic at home? And it feels like that after a few months, that became kind of an established pattern, established routines. Like, this is how we're just all hanging out at home, not doing anything.
Yeah.
And now with, more and more people getting vaccinated and all of that, I'm feeling all of this anxiety about, like, once this is all over, and like relearning or something, or adjusting to the new set of like rules of how to live life, I guess, sort of. And
for sure,
Sarah has this term called reentry that she uses after she's had like a big crash or been through like a hard spell, and has to kind of go back out into the world, and it's an adjustment. And so like that reentry, I'm definitely feeling a lot of anxiety around, as far as,
for sure,
it's going to feel really weird to be in a house with a lot of other people and nobody's wearing masks. Like, and there's good, that a time when that can happen and be safe is probably not super far off.
Right.
But that is going to be a huge, like, I don't know. We're so used to like seeing everyone masked and everything, like, and for me, I'm feeling a lot of anxiety around that. And I know that, I can't just stay isolating on and on. And yet I also know that, like, it's going to change some, but like we said, when we started this pandemic, like, things didn't change a whole lot for us.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of been something that I've been kind of spinning my wheels on, I guess.
Well, and I think a lot of people are feeling that, right? This anxiety of like, do I have to go? Especially that maybe introverts, right?
Yeah.
Of like, oh, I've gotten really used to this, and now I'm not used to crowds, and I'm not used to all these things. And again, I feel like we have this extra layer of trying to keep our people safe.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that is where some of the sadness is coming from, is just feeling sort of like left behind. Like the people are just like, well, here we go. Mm-hmm. And even people close to us are like, well, great. Well, once all the adults in our families get vaccinated, we can all just hang out. And I'm like, yeah, but there are the children. And then we don't know if it's working for Sean. And, all these pieces that just sort of feel like, do you guys not see us anymore? Like, do you forget what we're going through over here and what this means for us? And so I think that has been part of it, is like that, the sort of like any moments, like in the very beginning, so many people reached out and were like, oh my gosh, Allison, I didn't know that this is how you always felt. Like when people were suddenly like washing their hands and freaking out when people were sneezing, whatever, they were like, this is how you feel all the time. Now I get it.
Right.
And I feel like all of that is sort of like
gone
maybe. Yeah. And that they're going to be like, woohoo, we're back. And then forget that we're still in it, It
doesn't feel, I may be wrong, but it doesn't feel like once it's back to how things were and we're kind of still back in our caregiving role and everyone else is out there doing their thing, that there's going to be that collective memory of, we remember when we were in that situation like you and kind of felt that.
Right.
Like that's going to be a short memory for a lot of people.
I'm worried that it will be. Yeah. Yeah. And that they will be, I mean, our close people for sure are like, well, you guys are a little bit different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of them realize that. But I think that's what just feels hard, is it's like, well, just because everybody else gets to go live their life, like we can't yet, or we might, we don't know yet how that's going to work. And so I think that's been a hard thing, is like, I sort of have this hope about, like, cause I got my vaccine, Sean got his first vaccine, my parents got, sort of hopeful, but then also like, I don't know what this means. So it's like, we have the underlying anxiety, depression, we have caregiving level, and now we have a pandemic level.
Yeah. It is a lot.
Trifecta.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think I will say that I love that you and I over the time have had spaces, and like, I feel like my conversations with you over the years have been some of my most open about, like, oh yeah, my anxiety is bad today, or how's your, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that has felt really helpful, just to have a space. And I hope that us putting this into the airwaves helps other people realize that, like, they're not alone in this. And, I saw this article the other day from Roxanne Gay, who I love, an author. And she was talking about the pandemic, and like, and at some point, and I was watching all the news, and then I just got really anxious. I was having panic attacks. So I started taking Ativan. And I love how just like, she just like very matter of factly, you know what I mean? Which I feel like is new for our world. And so I think that's part of it, is just like, can we all start, caregivers or not, how do we sort of bring mental health issues out of the negative space? But then also for caregiving too, to sort of make people aware that, like, the load that we are carrying adds to any mental health challenges that we may have had before, or can create them for people who maybe didn't have them going into it.
Yeah. Yeah. What I've found is similar to, like with caregiving, finally finding, like similar people talking openly about their experiences, and how much that, allowed me to do the same, helped me be seen. It's the same thing talking about mental health stuff.
Yeah.
That I've found is, the more I've read of people or had conversations, the more it's felt like I'm not alone in this, and it is okay to, talk about this, I guess. And that's not to say it's easy.
Right.
It still feels like a very vulnerable thing. But yeah, I think it's important.
I mean, with the negative space, it makes me feel like that. Like, how many, when I'm on my Zoom calls, I'm looking at all the little faces, and I'm like, how many people are feeling this right now?
Yeah.
I have a coworker who, like, is at a standing desk, and you can tell when the topic gets tricky, almost starts like rocking, you know what I mean? Or like almost pacing. And I just kind of want to reach out through the Zoom and be like, hey, all right. You know what I mean? Yeah. But you can, like, and then you just wonder, like, how many people, like, that's a visual thing that I can see that tells me that perhaps she's feeling anxious in that moment. How many of us are just like, the little analogy about like the duck, like on the water, on the edge of the water, where cool and calm, but underneath our little feet are like paddle, 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 right?
Yep.
And so I think a lot of us are just walking around, with the mask on, not the face mask,
right?
the shield on of, like, I'm fine, everything's fine. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But really on the inside, we're just feeling like paddling ducks,
Yep.
you know? I do want to say real quick, are there things like if a supporter was listening,
yeah,
a supporter of a caregiver, what are things that you or I might want them to know or be aware of, or that they could do or say? Any thoughts on that?
That's a good question. And I don't have a list off the top of my head, but I think, like, for me, like, social anxiety is one manifestation of my anxiety. And so for someone to be aware that, that may be why I'm kind of not super engaged or something in that kind of setting.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are people who that's hard for, and beyond just being introverts. And so not to push them to, I don't know, be super engaged or something. I mean, for supporters to know that this is another thing that's going on.
Yeah.
And to maybe change their expectations, or just have a more understanding, I guess, of if we're not reaching out, or if we're just seem, I don't know, super anxious or something. Like, this is something that's going on with us. And just an acknowledgement, again, that like that must be really hard kind of thing, not a, have you tried this kind of thing, or this similar kind of thing.
Yeah.
But also, I think if if you know the person you're supporting well enough, and you see that they're not doing well, to like reach out and to talk to them about that if they're willing, and if they do need help, to help them get help. Yeah. When you're in it and when you're stuck in it, getting help feels like such a monumental thing, or maybe you can't even tell that you need it. And there has to be a certain level of, like, you have to have a good enough relationship with the person, I think, to be able to do that.
For sure.
But I think that's another important piece.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just making me think of so many other topics that you and I have talked about, right? Like, this feels like, in the beginning, we talked a lot about like the backpack that we're all carrying, right? And this is like another giant boulder in that backpack. And that when we physically feel anxious or depressed, everything else that we're doing feels harder, right? So an already hard job feels harder because we're having these like physical manifestations of these things. So recognizing that, I think about things like that we've talked about, but things you can take off of a caregiver's list. Like, like if I knew that like dinner was coming every Monday at 5, that's one less thing for me to feel worried about. Right. So some of those pieces, and I think about our conversation about toxic positivity, right? That like, certainly people could be like, well, don't worry. Well, don't worry. Just trust and it'll be fine. And worrying doesn't make it go away. And, all of those sort of platitudes.
Right. That reminds me of a comic I saw. It was two dinosaurs talking to each other, but one of them was saying, what's the worst that could happen? And then the other is, yes, I'm very familiar with that thought.
Right?
Yeah.
So true. So true. I love that. Yeah. So I think those are things like, people want to fix things. We've talked about that, right? And so like, if you see someone who's struggling, whether they're a caregiver or not, to realize like there aren't easy fixes. I love that you and I both talked today about like meditation and breathing, and that has actually really helped to both of us.
Yes.
And if someone would have been like, you tried meditation, I would have been like, I need you to walk away. Right.
I think maybe a different way to frame that for someone or a different way to help would be, if you're a supporter and you have your own, mental health stuff that you've been dealing with, share that with someone with the caregiver you're supporting, because having you initiate that conversation, then they may feel comfortable,
Good point.
Opening up about that. And if then there is that level of trust there, I would certainly be more open to someone saying, this is something that helped me.
For sure.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, for sure. I think that makes so much sense. And I think that's probably how you and I started, is that you were maybe just saying like, oh, my anxiety today or whatever. And so that just sort of opened the door to like, oh, this is a conversation we can have.
Yeah.
And by him saying that makes me feel like I could say that too. And so good point. That's a really good point. Yeah. Good to talk to you.
Yeah.
I feel like these are kind of I know I should like get a licensed therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And these conversations are good for my soul and my mental well-being. So I appreciate having the space to talk to you about these things. Thanks for being open and honest about all the stuff.
Yeah, you're welcome. You as well. These are definitely important conversations for me as well. Yeah. That help work through stuff and kind of put the things spinning around in my head kind of into clear or hopefully clear thoughts and words.
Yeah. No, for sure. And as we've said, neither of us are licensed anything related to this. But caregivers listening, if you ever want to, reach out, our inboxes are open. And so we're happy to talk and commiserate and listen, knowing that we are not licensed therapists, but we're in it here with you. So yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for talking today, friend.
Yeah.
I feel a little lighter than I did an hour ago. So thank you.
Good. I'm glad for that.
All right. See you later.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to In Sickness. Find us online at insickness.care or on Instagram at insicknesspodcast. You can send your questions and comments to insicknesspodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or fellow caregiver, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening, and take care.